see how much we can get through here tonight in the time we have. On Sunday, we talked about God's silence. And we talked about that period that the Bible doesn't explicitly say anything about. In fact, it's because it was that silent time from that last prophecy of Malachi in chapter 4, written about 430 years before Jesus was born, up until the time that Jesus came, or slightly before, because God begins to speak again. And we looked initially at how he spoke to Zacharias and his wife Elizabeth through the angel Gabriel, and how what an amazing time it was as that long period of silence was finally broken. And I will say this, and I said it on Sunday, that God may have been silent during that time, but God never, ever stopped working in time, in space, in history. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to start in Romans 8. This is a very familiar passage for lots of people. It was one that I memorized early on when I first became a Christian, starting in verse 28. And it says, "And we know, for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." Now there's a lot more in this verse than we're going to cover tonight. You know, there's this big debate that goes on within Christian circles today about God's sovereignty. And what does it mean for God to be 100% completely sovereign over all things? That is, that God controls or approves or permits or causes or acts in all things. We're not going to talk about that tonight. This verse talks about predestination. And what does that mean? And that's an excellent question, and we will cover that. The simple thing I want to point out in this verse is where all of that starts. As it talks about God working for our good, or rather for the good of those who love him, in all things, it talks about what God works based upon. Sort of where God's working finds its origin. And the very beginning of that in this passage is it says simply that for those he foreknew, he also, and then it gives us a list, right? He predestined them, and he justified them, and he glorified them. But it all started with God's foreknowledge. That is to say that God knew ahead of time, before it ever happened, exactly what was going to happen. And that the way that he works in our lives as believers is based upon God's foreknowledge. Now again, I don't want to get into the debate about free will, not free will, and all that. That's an important question that we will cover. But the simple point here is God has a complete and total knowledge of time. In fact, you might say time is simply a created thing that God created for us. You go back to the creation account, and it talks about how God gave the sun, and he gave the day and the night to separate the two. He gave us different seasons to separate the year into different segments, that he gave us these ways to measure out our lives that today we call time. But to God, for us, time is, in looking forward, is unknown, right? We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen the next second. Looking back is the only thing we do know, but is there anything we can do about it? We can't do anything about it. And yet for God, time is not a stream in which he lives, where he has little control over the future and can't do much about what's already gone by in the past. I always talk to my girls about time is more like a book to God, if you will. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, but it's a finite thing that for God, he sees it all at one time. He knows it all at one time, and he can He can interact or put himself anywhere in the timeline that is the book before God and act in time and space and history, but he's not confined by those things. Jesus described himself in Revelation as, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and I'm the end. And that's the way God is described. Even Psalm 139 is another really popular psalm where David writes that you knew every day of my life before one of them came to be. You know every word of my tongue before I speak it. And so God has this complete foreknowledge of life and of us. And God works in our lives based upon that foreknowledge. Now, I don't know about you, that's a big concept to wrap your head around. You know, I mean, the one way I might think of it is, years ago when I had time, I used to watch the Super Bowl. Every now and then, when I get time, I still sort of try to catch the Super Bowl, but it was the only football game of the season I'd ever watch, because I never had time to watch any other games. The only one I really cared about, because hey, it's the Super Bowl, and they have cool commercials and all that stuff, but I'd watch the Super Bowl. When I was overseas in Romania, I couldn't watch the Super Bowl, because I think we were 7 or 8 hours time difference from here, which meant being up in the middle of the night to try to watch the game and figure out what was going on. And the church over there, I'm dating myself, we had bought a VCR. Who here knows what a VCR is? Oh, wow. Okay, so I'm not as old as that. Right, you know those big cassettes you stick in and you record. And so we would try to record the Super Bowl and then watch it the next night over there. Just the mission team would do it together. And I got to tell you, it's not quite as much fun because it's already happened. You know, there's not the excitement of, oh, are they going to drop the ball, or are they going to score? Some of you look at me like, I don't care anything about football, Mark, and that's okay, I relate because I don't anymore. But my point was that it had already happened. Okay, the game was done, and so I could watch the game, but I sort of already knew the beginning from the end. So it totally influenced the way I thought about it. The difference is, unlike God, who can see the beginning from the end, based on his knowledge of what happens at the end of the game, he can choose to work in the game based upon his foreknowledge of what's going to happen. I can't do that, but that's sort of how God looks at history. So I want you to keep that thought in your mind as we look at another verse that's very germane to what we all remember this time of year. And it's Galatians chapter 4, if you would turn there. Galatians chapter 4, starting in verse 1. This is Paul writing, inspired by the Holy Spirit. He says, now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, though he is owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father. It's talking about us, by the way, in our relationship together with the law and what that means for us. So also we, while we were children, we were held in bondage under the basic principles of the world. Well, that's something we've studied a lot together as a church. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. So this passage, as it talks again about how God interacts with people, and how God acts in time and space and history, it says a couple of things, but the big expression it uses, it says, when the fullness of time had come, that's when Jesus entered the world. At the fullness of time. In fact, that phrase, fullness of time in the Greek, is actually a phrase that often, not always, but often was used to describe when a woman came to the point of giving birth. It was about pregnancy, that, you know, there's this period of time when there's all this stuff going on inside of a woman's body to form the life of this new child. And there's all these stages, and it's amazing today because we have technology and we can see those stages when that fetus is forming and developing and growing, and it starts just as a few cells, and then they multiply and they get bigger, and all of a sudden you get eyeballs and organs and fingers and hands and feet, and it's an incredible miracle, but all that is working towards a specific date. What do we call that?
Birthday.
Well, birthday, a due date, right? I'm not talking about when we celebrate it every year. There's a specific, this is when the child is supposed to be born. Now, it doesn't always happen exactly on the due date. In fact, I would guess probably a lot of times it doesn't happen exactly on the date. But there's all this stuff going on leading to a specific moment in time when all the stuff going on inside that woman becomes its own separate life. And that expression here in this passage about when the fullness of time had come is the same kind of expression that all of history, that all of time, that everything that was happening in the universe was coming to its fullness, was coming to its completion, to its totality in the mind and the plan of God, so that now was the time for Christ to be born. And that's an incredible thought when you sort of wrap your mind around that. In fact, as he's talking about that analogy here in this verse, when he goes back and he talks about, we're no longer slaves and we're going to be adopted, and that there's a time when under a will, when you move from childhood into manhood and you receive the inheritance, it says the Father has a set date for that to happen. And that same concept applies to God, that God has specific set dates. In fact, Acts 17, you can write this one down, Acts 17:26, there's another verse I memorized as a young Christian. When Paul is in Athens on one of his missionary journeys, and he's walking around and he's preaching to the Greek people, he sees an idol with an inscription under it, a statue that says to an unknown God. He says, what you worship is something unknown, I'm now going to declare to you. And he goes into this little sermon about who God is. And one of the things he says in that sermon, in verse 26, is that God has determined the times set for people and the exact boundaries of their lives, the places where they will live and dwell and have their being. And so again, you get this notion that God is a God who determines and plans and sets specific dates. He had a very specific date in mind for when Christ would be born. When the Word would become flesh. When the Logos, if you will, that's the way the book of John starts, that what's translated as Word, the Logos in Greek, would be engraved on the parchment of human skin. God had a specific date for that, when that was going to happen. In fact, when he made the promise in the Garden of Eden, our family has been reading in Genesis for the last week or so, and when he made that promise in the Garden of Eden about the seed of woman will crush the seed of the serpent, he already knew exactly when Jesus would come. That word fullness in Greek, I think we've talked about it once before because it's used also in the scriptures to talk about the church being the fullness of Christ. That Christ was the fullness of God and the church is the fullness of Christ. That word in Greek is pleroma, and it literally means the completion, the totality of, the fulfillment of. And so I share all this to say that God always had a specific plan about exactly when he would fulfill the promise he made back in Genesis. And see, we have the benefit of looking back, and I joke all the time, hindsight is always 20/20, isn't it? You can always look back and, oh, of course I see it now. And we look back, but the people who lived in that day didn't have 2020 hindsight. They had to base it on something else. And really, that's kind of the sad thing, because Jesus comes, and Jesus talks, and this is in the latter parts of the book of Matthew and some other places, he talks about the destruction of the temple, and eventually he talks about his second coming, and his disciples ask him, well, when is that going to happen? Which is an interesting thought to think that God also has already a very specific date that he has determined that's when it's going to happen. In fact, this phrase, the fullness of time, is used elsewhere in the scriptures also about his second coming. But when Jesus was asked that question, one of the things Jesus says, he talked about the importance of being able to interpret the signs. He says, you look and you can tell when the seasons are going to change. You can tell when winter is coming. You can tell when the harvest is due. You're able to look and interpret those signs. Well, similarly, you ought to look at the signs that God is giving you, because although you may not know the exact dates, you need to be ready. You need to be prepared. And the reality is that the Jews had lots of signs to point to when the Messiah would come. I mean, there's all these prophecies that pointed to when the Messiah would come. There's all this symbolism and stuff that goes on. They had all this rich history. In fact, this is the time of year we remember the Magi, right? We've got three of them sitting out there in the foyer. You've seen them, right? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Okay, just making sure. Pay attention. We got three sitting out there. Well, the Magi weren't Jews. They weren't of the people of God. They were total foreigners. And yet somehow they were able to figure it out. Just based on their knowledge of astrology or astronomy, and looking at the skies and the star. And yet God's own people missed it. They completely missed it. If they had been looking, maybe they would have seen it. But this is also a theme you see throughout the scriptures, and Jesus brings this up time and time again, that it's the foreigners. It's sadly, unfortunately, not God's people, but often the Gentiles who figure out what God is doing before he does it, or while he's doing it. And I think for the Jews, just thinking back to the stuff we talked about on Sunday, I wonder if through the course of history, how often they must have thought to themselves, okay, God, you promised a Messiah. We've heard the prophecies. We know there's these prophecies. You're going to send us a deliverer. Now would be a good time to send the Messiah. And they were looking. In fact, we talked about it in the book of Genesis with my family. He makes this promise in the garden. Adam and Eve are there. They get cast out of paradise, out of the garden. They've heard God tell the serpent that the seed of the woman will crush the seed of the serpent. And then they give birth to Cain and Abel. And I'm thinking, if I'm Eve, I'm wondering, is this the one? I mean, he just said the seed of the woman. I'm the woman. I'm the mother of all living. Could it be that Cain, my firstborn, is the fulfillment of this promise that God is making? We all know how that went, right? Yes? Yeah. Didn't go so well. No, it wasn't Cain. It wasn't Abel. But you think through history how often they must have thought things like that. Clearly they thought it in Egypt when they cried out to God for a deliverer. He sent them Moses, who prefigures Christ for us. Clearly there were times they felt that going against other foreign enemies in the promised land, like the Philistines or the Amalekites, the Amorites, times when Jerusalem was under siege, when people were starving, I can't imagine they weren't thinking this would be a good time to send the Messiah. They didn't come. Even under, if you've ever read the book of Esther, where the Jews were about to be completely wiped out as a race under the Persian exile. Completely wiped out. This would be a good time. We need the Messiah right now. We need a deliverer. Instead, God used Esther. So, why did Jesus come when he finally did? What does it mean when God says, when the fullness of time came? When history literally was ready to deliver the Messiah. What does that mean? And I'm going to give you some thoughts tonight. I would say this. We can only look with man's eyes. We can't ultimately know with certainty exactly what was in the mind of God. But we can certainly speculate based upon, we do know now when he came. I mean, we do know, actually we don't know the exact year when he came. I know we all, it's not the year 0, as most people probably think when our calendars change. Most people tell you that's probably not when Jesus was born. Just like he wasn't probably crucified in AD 33 either. We're off a year or 2 or 3 or maybe as many as 7 on that. We know sort of approximately when he came. One thing we do know with certainty. We know that all of time, all of history, everything that happens is ultimately subject to God's complete and divine authority and sovereignty. That he rules the nations. You heard me share about that on Sunday, right? He moved in the heart of 3 or 4 different Persian kings to just randomly send the Jews back to go rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls around Jerusalem while they were in exile. He acts in space and time, and ultimately God causes everything to conform to the specific plan that he has. So I want to give you a little bit of perspective on why I think, maybe, with my limited human vision, God brought Jesus. The Word became flesh. That the incarnation came to us when he did. Some of these I'm going to touch on very lightly, and actually, I would encourage you, if ever you wanted to bring somebody to church, bring them this Sunday. One of the 2 easiest Sundays of the year to do it, right? Because we all know the CEOs out there, Christian Easter only. You all know what I'm talking about. Right? This should be an easy Sunday to bring people, but I will tell you, we're going to talk about this first point in much bigger depth on Sunday. But the first thing is just history and prophecy. You go back and you look and you read all these prophecies in the Old Testament that talk about the coming of Christ. Not just talk about his life. There are prophecies about his life too, but talk about the signs that God would establish for when Christ would come. It's amazing how specific they are. It is amazing how much they point to the specific time in history when he was born. I'll give you an example of one you know already because we've studied it as a church. When we were studying out God establishing his kingdom on earth, and not everybody maybe was here, we read that crazy dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2. Remember that? Had this crazy dream of this big statue and this rock cut out of, not by human hands, comes and smashes the statue. The statue's made of all this different stuff, gold, silver, bronze mixed with clay. You remember that one? And then that rock that smashes it grows to become a mountain that fills the whole earth. And Daniel talks about the meaning of that dream was a succession of kingdoms that would happen on the earth. And in the time of the final kingdom, the one that's the bronze mixed with clay, it's not totally united, but has some of the strength of, iron mixed with clay, not bronze, has some of the strength of iron with it, even with the brittleness of clay in it. He says, in the time of those kings, God will establish a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Remember that one? Right? I mean, that is written centuries upon centuries before Christ was ever born. And yet we can look back with 20/20 hindsight, but I submit to you the Jews, even in the days of Christ, could have looked back with 20/20 hindsight and said, well, okay, we were under Babylon, and Daniel said that Babylon was the head of gold of the statue, and Babylon was followed by the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire. Well, that's the silver, and that's Daniel in the lion's den. We all know that story. under Darius, and that's the time of Esther, that's the time of Nehemiah, that's the time of Ezra, under different kings, Artaxerxes and Cyrus and some others. Okay, so that happened, and then after the Medo-Persians, they were replaced by who? By the Greeks, under Alexander the Great. So that's the bronze. And then they were replaced by, at the time, the most powerful empire to ever reign on the earth, that dominated all the others exactly like was predicted in the dream, and it's the Roman Empire. And so you would think that the Jews, knowing that prophecy, and that's just one of a number of ones in the Old Testament, but knowing that prophecy, would read the signs and say, wait a second, we're living in the time of the kingdom during which the Messiah will come. Would that not be amazing if we knew that about the second coming? I mean, can you consider if we had that kind of knowledge that wow, there's this dream and it's going to be, not I'm making this up obviously, but it's going to be during the Trump administration. We laugh, but can you imagine, I mean, if you're looking back and you're paying attention to what the Bible says, if you could know, you don't know the exact day, nobody's going to know it. Jesus said he doesn't even know it. Only the Father knows. But that's what the Jews had. And yet, somehow, they missed it. You even think about the symbolism of this, the period of silence that I'm talking about. I mean, is it a coincidence that 430 years pass of silence when you look back in Israel's history, and clearly the biggest prefiguring of Christ you have in the whole Old Testament is, anybody want to guess? It's Egypt. It's Egypt. And God sending Moses as a deliverer to deliver them from their bondage in Egypt into the promised land, to establish his people Israel in their own land. Well, how long were they in Egypt before the deliverer brought them out? Go ahead and say it, Ben.
400 years.
400 years. In fact, go back and read your Bibles, this is Deuteronomy, 430 years, to be precise, which is exactly the same amount of time that passed between Malachi's final words, the last words of the Old Testament, and Jesus' birth. See, the signs all pointed to it. The fullness all coming together. Well, what do I think might be some other things? Well, the Jewish dispersion. And what I mean by that is, if you follow sort of the history of the Jews during that 400 years, and as they bounced from empire to empire, and in there they had a little bit of freedom, a little bit of independence, but it didn't last very long under the Maccabees, and that's apocryphal stuff if you ever want to read those stories. But essentially what happened during those 400 years is there was a resurgence of Jewish zeal amongst pockets of the Jews in the silence when God wasn't speaking anymore. And they were concerned, wow, people are losing their passion, they're losing their zeal, they're becoming unfaithful. And so there were these groups of Jews that rose up to call the people and stir the people back to their first love, back to the worship of God and away from idolatry. That's actually the genesis of the Pharisees. Sadly, they went the wrong way. But the Pharisees began during that silent period. And part of that resurgence of Jewish zeal was they began to establish synagogues in all these cities as they were bouncing from empire to empire, so that the Jews would have a place to worship wherever they were. In fact, a lot of that happened under when they were under the Greek Empire. So they established all these synagogues so that by the time you're in the Roman Empire, they're everywhere. How do we know that? Well, look at the book of Acts. Paul's missionary journeys. Every time he goes to a city, where does he go first? He goes to the synagogue to preach about Jesus, because they were everywhere. And so while the Jews were scattered under exile, could it be that God was using that scattering to set up a system by which the spread of the gospel and the spread of the news of Jesus Christ would be so much faster and so much easier? Because you have all these foreign nations who now, they're getting used to having people around them who essentially are talking about this idea of there's one God who speaks through prophets, who write down and encode his word in books. Do you think that might have been helpful to when Jesus came? I mean, that's why you have people like the centurion in the Gospels, and then the other centurion, Cornelius, in the book of Acts, who already knew about God and were God-fearing by the time they have an encounter either with Christ or with his church.
Mark,
Yes, sir.
one additional thing that you kind of alluded to there is the fact that because the Romans controlled everything, there was not they weren't limited by boundaries and state lines and territory lines. They could travel as they pleased, so they could just go anywhere.
Exactly right. And that's sort of the next 20/20 hindsight I would point out. I mean, you sort of got all history and the prophets talking about it. Then you've got the Jews being spread out all over the place, to a specific point in time to make it easy for the spread of the gospel. And then you look at the Roman Empire itself. I mean, it's pretty amazing. What did the Roman Empire do? Well, number one, they built roads across most of the known world at that day. You could literally walk from Egypt to France. And not just walk, because you had all these easy roads to get anywhere you wanted to go throughout the empire, but this was also during what's known as the Pax Romana, the time of incredible Roman peace. Very few wars, very few foreign invasions. The roads were by and large incredibly safe from bandits and all those kind of things. That was a big problem prior to. And yet under the Roman Empire, instead, what you have are all these safe roads that let you easily get anywhere you need to go, which didn't exist under the Greeks, didn't exist under the Medes and Persians, didn't exist under the Babylonians. But by the time Christ enters history, all of a sudden you have this easy way for itinerant preachers, apostles, and Christians scattered by persecution to go anywhere they needed to go to spread the gospel of Christ. More than that, this is also interesting. I mean, what was the official language of the Roman Empire? Anybody know? That wasn't the official one. Latin was the official one. Guess what percentage of the Roman population actually spoke Latin? You can fit it between my fingers. The unofficial language of the Roman Empire, the one that was spoken across the empire, from Egypt to France, from Persia to Britain, was Koine Greek. It was a very simple, common language. And so it made communication incredibly easy. I will tell you, having gone to several foreign countries where I had to learn to speak the language, it is a lot harder to talk about anything, groceries, much less Jesus and the deeper things of life and what it means to give up everything to follow him, when you can barely speak better than a kindergartner. They didn't have that issue. Because when Jesus was born, you had this dominant world empire that had created this safe network of roads and traveling system with one common language that they could communicate with almost anybody, anywhere. That's amazing. In fact, this common Koine Greek is the language in which our New Testament is written. More so, during this time, it's also the language that the Old Testament was translated into. It's called the Septuagint, for those who've ever heard that word. The Septuagint is the Koine Greek version of the Old Testament. Well, why is that significant? Well, guess which Old Testament Jesus quoted from? The Septuagint. Guess which Old Testament all the apostles quote from? The Septuagint. When they're quoting Scripture, they don't go back to the original Aramaic or the original Hebrew. They're actually quoting the Greek version. And so, again, you have this time that made the Scriptures accessible. Back then, the only Scriptures they had until the New Testament was eventually being written and put together and canonized, all they had was the Old Testament, but it was making even the Old Testament, or their Bible, if you were, possible. and accessible. And I'll add one more thought here. Most of the population of Rome were either poor or slaves. Why do I think that's significant? I'm just going to give you my perspective, having been in a number of third world countries. Something about suffering, poverty, hardship tends to open people's hearts more to the gospel. Have there been slaves and poverty throughout history? Absolutely. But the vast majority, some historians estimate upwards of 90% of the Roman population were poor, or were slaves, or were both. It was a ripe field. And so you look back, and the fullness of time, I see God working to bring his Son at a time when the message, the good news, could explode. Not sort of gradually trickle out there and get to everyone. Because what was the promise made to Abraham? That this will be a blessing for who? All nations. All people. Not just the Israelites. I think we see God working to bring history to this one point where it was time to finally inject himself in the form of man. Not only the perfect time for Jesus to be born, but the perfect time for the message of Christ to spread all over the world. Something which has not been repeated even to this day. You know, the Bible records for us that the gospel has reached all creation. If you believe the Bible is true, and if it is inerrant, that's never happened again since. Although we're certainly trying.
Mark, can I add one more thing?
Yes,
I think
sir.
one of the other things too that helped as well is that under the Romans they took apart all of these Greek idols and all of this stuff, and of course the Romans added their part of it to it, so you had a conglomeration of all these idols that was supposed to be helping the people and delivering the people. It kind of goes along with the forethought that you had there. And these idols just wasn't getting it done for the people, so they were looking for something.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, Paul there at Mars Hill, you know, is typically, I mean, he says, look at all this, but I'm going to take the real one.
Right.
You know, so,
Yeah, I mean, it's
so people were looking for
it's
something.
very much, absolutely, it's very much the sense when Jesus said, the fields are ripe for harvest. You know, and I'm learning this now that we have fruit trees, you know, that there is a time when things, they're finally ready to be picked. You know, there's this moment when you say, okay, it's, you know, that apple, it's okay, it's very green right now, and okay, now it's sort of green, a little bit yellow right now, and now it's sort of yellow, a little bit pink right now, and now it's pink and yellow, and a little bit red right now, but there's this point in time when it's ready, it's ripe. And that's the same notion of, I believe, what God was doing through the course of history. So why is all this important? Because I know we're out of time, but I think this is the important thing. I think the same question now applies to us as did to God's people back then, who sadly missed what God was doing. And I'm not just talking about when Christ comes again. I'm talking about the fact that how well do we interpret and see and understand what God is doing now? Because there hasn't been any more revelation since Revelation, right? I mean, the Bible stopped being written in the book of Revelation with the Apostle John, and in case we ever wondered, he tells us at the end, anybody adds words to this, they're toast. Bad idea. Don't do that. This is it. Then we've entered our own, if you will, silent period. It's lasted a little under 2,000 years so far. Does that mean God has stopped working? Does that mean that God's plan is kind of on standby? And I ask those, I know we kind of go, no, that's kind of a stupid question, Mark, but I think some of us live that way. Where we're not actively, consciously thinking and looking for for what is it that God is doing? And how is He working? And what are the signs He wants me to discover and read and understand? And frankly, even seek to fulfill. In fact, I wasn't going to read this, but I'll read this in closing. I read this to the Bible study class Sunday night. Ben's been going through the book of Ephesians. Let's read it. Let's close with this very well-known verse. Ephesians chapter 2. Starting in verse 8. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. We love that. I love that. It's not based on my merit. It's not based on how well I do. It's not, I can't earn anything. But that's not where it stops. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for what? For good works. In case we misunderstood, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. You see, God's plan didn't stop with Christ. The Bible teaches that God has a specific plan of good works for His people to do. The question is, are we doing it? Are we following His plan? Do we see His plan unfolding? It's always about God's story. This is the time of year people go nuts in preparation, right? I mean, we do. We talk about all the stress and everything. I got to cook this. I got to bake this. Oh, I baked this and it went bad. Speaking from our own experience at home, last night, 1 o'clock in the morning, you know, there's all these preparations that go into the festivities and the celebration and what we're doing this time of year. Imagine if you put all that effort and work into having all these people over and the specific plan of what you wanted to have accomplished, and you baked all these things, and you cooked all these things, and you put out the tablecloth, and you pull out your best china, and you clean up your house to look perfect. You all relate to what I'm talking about? Yeah? Okay? And you do all the stuff, and then nobody shows up. Or 1 or 2 people show up. How would you feel? I think the answer speaks for itself, doesn't it? See, we have to ask the same exact question of ourselves in relationship to God's plans. He sets the times. He sets the dates. He has specific plans in mind. And as we celebrate the fulfillment of one of those plans, the big one that came to fruition this time of year, let's not miss that somehow that's the finish. That's not the finish line. That's the beginning for all of us.